The silence arrived without warning, and that was what unsettled people the most. Because for more than 40 years, Vince McMahon had never been quiet, never absent, never out of reach. And yet suddenly the man who once filled arenas with his voice and presence seemed to dissolve into the background, leaving behind only rumors, fragments, and uneasy glances. Whispers began circulating among fans and insiders alike, not about storylines or ratings, but about something far more real, something that could not be scripted or controlled. There were reports of hospital visits, of long recoveries, of a body no longer obeying the will that once drove it relentlessly forward. The images that surfaced were brief and jarring: a stiff walk, a thinner frame, a face that looked drained of the defiant energy people had grown used to seeing. For a man whose entire life had been built on domination and spectacle, this quiet withdrawal felt almost unreal, as if the world was watching a titan fade between frames, unnoticed until the absence became impossible to ignore. Those who had followed his career remembered a figure who thrived on confrontation, who stood in the center of controversy without flinching, who turned even public outrage into fuel. He had survived scandals, lawsuits, public humiliation, and physical punishment that would have broken most people long before middle age. He had torn muscles on live television and refused to leave the ring, barked orders while unable to stand, laughed in the face of critics who predicted his downfall again and again. That history made the current moment feel deeply unsettling, because this time there was no defiance, no statement, no grand gesture to reclaim control. There was only silence, and silence, in the world Vince McMahon created, was never neutral. It carried weight. It raised questions no one was used to asking. What happens when the man who always insisted on being in charge can no longer command a room, or even his own body? What happens when the engine that drove an entire industry finally begins to stall? For fans who grew up watching him loom larger than life, this was not just about concern for his health. It felt like the slow collapse of a myth they had unconsciously believed in, the idea that sheer willpower could outrun time, that obsession could overpower biology, that a man who worked harder than anyone else might somehow be exempt from the rules that govern everyone. The early signs were easy to dismiss at first. A missed appearance here, a shortened role there, a return that felt more symbolic than commanding. People told themselves he was resting, recalibrating, planning his next move because that was always the explanation that made sense with him. But over time, the pattern became harder to ignore. He was no longer the omnipresent force behind every decision. Others were stepping in, handling creative direction, managing the day-to-day machinery of the empire he had built. The machine kept running, but its creator was no longer visible at the controls. That contrast cut deep. An empire designed to reflect one man's vision was proving it could survive without him, and that realization carried a quiet cruelty of its own. Then came the moment that shifted the tone entirely, when someone from his inner circle, someone who had stood beside him through decades of chaos and triumph, allowed a sliver of truth to slip through the cracks. The words were not dramatic or polished. They were raw, personal, and stripped of bravado. Something was wrong, not just physically, but emotionally. He was not the man he used to be. For the first time, the narrative was no longer being controlled by corporate silence or carefully managed appearances. It was being shaped by concern, by grief, by the recognition that even the strongest personas eventually give way to human vulnerability. That was when the story stopped feeling like gossip and started feeling like a reckoning. Because whether people loved Vince McMahon or despised him, whether they saw him as a visionary or a tyrant, his influence was undeniable. He reshaped an entire form of entertainment, launched careers that became global icons, and built a cultural machine that still runs at full speed. Watching that man fade quietly from view forced a confrontation with an uncomfortable truth. Legends are built on endurance, but they are undone by the same passage of time that claims everyone else. The heartbreak in this story is not only about a man facing his limits. It is about the realization that the larger-than-life figures we grow up believing in are, in the end, just as fragile as the rest of us. And when they disappear without explanation, the silence they leave behind can be louder than any roar they ever commanded. Long before the world knew his name, before arenas shook and cameras followed his every move, Vince McMahon was shaped by instability, distance, and an unspoken hunger that never quite left him. His childhood was not the origin story of a privileged heir, but of a boy who grew up without a father, moving from place to place, absorbing chaos as a normal state of being. He did not meet his biological father until he was already a teenager, and when that meeting finally happened, it carried more weight than any formal inheritance ever could. His father was already embedded in the wrestling business, running a modest regional promotion that operated by old rules, quiet agreements, and deeply ingrained traditions. For most people, that world would have seemed small, limiting, even comfortable in its predictability. For Vince, it felt suffocating. From the very beginning, he did not see wrestling as it was. He saw what it could become if every boundary was broken and every risk embraced. That difference in vision would define everything that followed. Even in his early years, those around him noticed something unusual in his demeanor. He was intense, obsessive, and relentlessly driven, but also guarded, as if he believed the world could turn on him at any moment. Trust did not come easily. Control mattered more than comfort. When he eventually took over the company, it was not merely a business transaction. It was a declaration of intent. He was not going to preserve a legacy. He was going to overwrite it. The wrestling industry at the time was built on unwritten codes, regional respect, and quiet cooperation. Vince ignored all of that. He expanded nationally, siphoned talent from competitors, leveraged cable television, and gambled everything on spectacles that others considered reckless. That willingness to risk total collapse became one of his defining traits. Failure was not an option he allowed himself to consider, and that mindset bled into every aspect of his life. As the company grew, so did his reputation. He was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Publicly, he was the architect of a booming entertainment empire. Privately, he was a man who slept little, trained obsessively, and expected everyone around him to match his pace. Those who worked under him often described the environment as electrifying and terrifying in equal measure. There were no limits on effort, no tolerance for excuses. If he could work through pain, exhaustion, and personal sacrifice, he believed others should be able to do the same. That belief earned him loyalty from some and quiet resentment from others. But it always reinforced one thing. The company revolved around him. Over time, Vince did something few executives ever attempt. He stepped directly into the spotlight and made himself part of the product. The on-screen character was exaggerated, cruel, and theatrical, but it was rooted in truths people already sensed. The arrogance, the obsession with dominance, the refusal to back down. By turning himself into a villain, he gained something even more powerful than control. He gained myth. Audiences did not just watch the show. They watched him. They reacted to him. They projected onto him everything they loved and hated about power. Behind the scenes, however, the lines between character and reality blurred. Vince did not simply play a tyrant. He lived like one. His days followed punishing routines. Early mornings, intense workouts, long flights, endless meetings, constant rewrites. Illness was dismissed. Fatigue was treated as weakness. Even age was something he refused to acknowledge. As new stars rose and the company became publicly traded, many assumed he would step back, delegate, and adapt. Instead, he tightened his grip. Creative decisions, business strategy, and cultural tone all flowed through him. For decades, that approach worked. The company thrived. His instincts, though sometimes criticized, continued to deliver results. That success reinforced his worldview. He believed that letting go was dangerous, that slowing down meant surrender, and that surrender was unacceptable. Yet beneath the confidence, there were signs of strain that few paid attention to at the time. The physical toll of decades of stunts and appearances accumulated quietly. Surgeries were endured without complaint. Injuries were hidden behind tailored suits and controlled smiles. Even those closest to him noticed that his intensity sometimes crossed into rigidity. He clung to habits, rituals, and routines with almost superstitious devotion, as if breaking them might invite collapse. Family members and longtime colleagues occasionally urged him to rest, to delegate, to consider a future beyond constant control. He resisted every suggestion. Work was not just what he did, it was who he was. Without it, there was an emptiness he did not know how to confront. As the years passed, the world around him changed. Audiences evolved. Technology reshaped entertainment. Social media altered how fans interacted with wrestling. Younger executives began pushing for different approaches, different voices, different rhythms. Vince listened, but rarely yielded. His instincts were formed in an earlier era, and he trusted them above all else. That tension created fractures, subtle at first, then increasingly visible. Some admired his refusal to compromise. Others saw it as a stubbornness that bordered on denial. Still, the machine kept moving, and, as long as it did, few questioned the cost. Looking back now, it becomes easier to see how the foundations of the current moment were laid years earlier. A life built entirely around dominance left little room for vulnerability. A career defined by control left no script for surrender. The same traits that allowed Vince McMahon to rise from an uncertain childhood to the pinnacle of global entertainment also trapped him inside an identity that could not easily adapt to decline. The empire he built was strong, but the man at its center had given so much of himself to maintain it that there was little left outside the role he created. And as time began to press harder against him, the question was no longer whether he could continue at the same pace, but whether he even knew how to exist any other way. The moment when everything began to feel different did not arrive with a single headline or a dramatic announcement, but rather through a slow accumulation of signals that only made sense once people looked back. For years, Vince McMahon had weathered controversy as if it were part of his natural environment. Allegations, lawsuits, public criticism, internal dissent, all of it had surfaced before, and each time he emerged seemingly untouched, sometimes even stronger. That pattern created a sense of inevitability around him, the belief that no matter how fierce the storm, he would always be standing at the center of it, defiant and unmovable. But when reports surfaced in 2022 about hush money payments connected to misconduct allegations, the response felt different from anything that had come before. His public statement announcing that he would step down was brief, almost sterile, stripped of emotion and theatrical flair. It read like a corporate formality, not a personal reckoning. At first, many assumed this was simply another tactical retreat, a pause before the inevitable return. And in a sense, they were right. He did come back. Within months, he was reinstated to the board, exerting influence behind the scenes, positioning himself as an indispensable architect of corporate strategy. On paper, it looked like a familiar power play. Yet beneath the surface, something fundamental had shifted. His return lacked the commanding presence people expected. He was not visible at live shows. He was not constantly backstage. He was no longer the relentless overseer rewriting scripts until dawn. Those absences, once unthinkable, became normalized. At the same time, physical changes began to draw attention. In carefully curated appearances, he moved more slowly. His posture seemed guarded. His face, once taut with intensity, appeared sunken and drawn. Fans who had spent decades studying every detail of his on-screen persona noticed immediately. They compared clips, screenshots, old footage against new sightings, and the contrast was impossible to ignore. This was not merely aging. It felt abrupt, as if years of strain had finally condensed into a visible reckoning. Quiet reports began circulating about major medical procedures. A lengthy spinal surgery that left him struggling to walk without assistance. A hip replacement that further limited his mobility. These were not minor interventions. especially for a man approaching 80 who had spent a lifetime abusing his body in the name of control and spectacle. Officially, nothing was confirmed. There were no statements detailing his condition, no interviews explaining his recovery. As always, silence was the chosen strategy. But this time, silence did not protect the narrative. It amplified suspicion. Then came the public sighting that changed the tone of the conversation entirely. Cameras captured him leaving a luxury suite at a major sporting event, moving stiffly, visibly frail, leaning on a cane. The footage spread rapidly, not with mockery, but with shock. Fans who had grown up watching him stride into arenas with exaggerated confidence struggled to reconcile that image with the man on screen. It felt invasive, almost uncomfortable to witness such vulnerability in someone who had spent his life refusing to acknowledge it. Insiders attempted to reassure observers, insisting he was recovering, that his mind remained sharp, that his influence had not diminished. But the visual evidence told a different story. Behind closed doors, the structure of power within the company continued to evolve. Creative control, once his most fiercely guarded domain, was now firmly in other hands. Decisions were being made without his direct involvement. The day-to-day operations ran smoothly, efficiently, without the constant presence that had defined the organization for decades. For the first time, it became clear that the machine he built could function independently of him. That realization carried a particular cruelty. He had dedicated his life to ensuring that nothing moved without his approval, and now everything moved on regardless. As these shifts unfolded, the emotional weight of the situation deepened. People who had worked with him for years began to speak quietly, cautiously, about changes they had noticed. Moments of hesitation during conversations. Instances where he seemed distracted or withdrawn. A reluctance to stand for long periods. None of these signs alone would have caused alarm, but together they painted a picture of decline that no amount of reputation could fully conceal. The most striking element of this period was not just his physical deterioration, but the way he withdrew from the very thing that had defined him. He did not address the public. He did not confront the rumors. He did not attempt to reassert his dominance through spectacle or confrontation. Instead, he receded. For a man who had built an empire on visibility and control, that retreat felt profoundly unnatural. It suggested not strategy, but limitation. And then came the reports that pushed concern into something closer to grief. Accounts emerged suggesting that he had been hospitalized again, this time described by those close to the situation as frail, quiet, and barely recognizable. There were no details, no timelines, no official confirmation. Just descriptions that contrasted sharply with the image he had cultivated for a lifetime. A man once obsessed with projecting strength, now reduced to recovery rooms and whispered updates. The wrestling world, accustomed to dramatic twists and scripted shock, struggled to process the reality that this was not a storyline. There would be no comeback angle, no triumphant return to the spotlight. What unfolded instead was something far more unsettling. A slow erasure. The man who had always insisted on being seen on his own terms was now being seen only through fragments, through second-hand accounts and fleeting footage. Fans reacted with a mixture of disbelief and sorrow. Some revisited old clips, moments of excess and bravado, watching them with a new lens. Others expressed anger, not at him, but the inevitability of it all. The idea that someone so dominant, so relentless, could be undone not by rivals or scandal, but by time itself, felt almost unfair. What made this period especially painful was the absence of closure. There was no official farewell, no acknowledgement of transition, no narrative to help people make sense of the change. Just unanswered questions and a growing awareness that the era had already ended, quietly, without permission. The tragedy of this chapter lies not only in the decline of a powerful figure, but in the collision between a lifetime spent denying vulnerability and the inescapable reality of it. Vince McMahon had built his identity around endurance, around the belief that effort could conquer all. Now, confronted with limits he could not negotiate with or overpower, he seemed to retreat into silence. And that silence forced everyone watching to confront an uncomfortable truth. Even the most commanding figures are ultimately subject to the same fragile constraints as everyone else. The difference is that when they fall quiet, the absence echoes much louder. The impact of this slow unraveling extended far beyond one man and reached into every corner of the world he had built, reshaping relationships, power structures, and emotional landscapes in ways that were both subtle and profound. Inside the company, the shift was immediate, even if it was never formally acknowledged. Meetings once dominated by his presence took on a different tone. Decisions that previously required his approval moved forward without it. The creative process, long constrained by a single vision, began to breathe in new directions. For many, this change brought relief. For others, it created an uneasy sense of disorientation. An institution that had revolved around one gravitational force for decades was learning how to exist without it, and that transition carried both opportunity and loss. Those who had built their careers under his leadership struggled with conflicting emotions. Gratitude for the platform he provided mixed with resentment over years of pressure and fear. Admiration for his brilliance collided with memories of exhaustion, stress, and personal sacrifice. As his influence receded, people were forced to reevaluate their own identities within the organization. Some thrived in the new environment, finding space to innovate and assert themselves. Others felt unmoored, as if the rules of the world they had learned to navigate had suddenly changed without warning. Outside the company, the reaction was even more complex. Fans who had spent years dissecting every move, every promo, every controversy found themselves grappling with something they were not accustomed to seeing. Vulnerability, the larger-than-life villain, the symbol of unchecked power, was no longer towering over the industry. He was fading quietly, and that reality triggered an unexpected wave of empathy. People who had once cheered his humiliation or criticized his methods now spoke with concern and sadness. Not because his past actions were forgotten, but because decline has a way of humanizing even the most polarizing figures. The absence of official information intensified this emotional response. In a culture conditioned to constant updates and public statements, the lack of clarity felt unsettling. Rumors filled the void, speculation multiplied, and every rare sighting became a point of analysis. The silence from corporate leadership, while consistent with long-standing habits, now carried a different weight. It was no longer just about protecting a brand. It felt like a collective acknowledgement that there was nothing reassuring to say. That quiet, more than any headline, signaled the seriousness of the moment. Within his family, the consequences were deeply personal. Decades of shared ambition, partnership, and endurance had given way to concern and grief. The woman who had stood beside him through triumphs and scandals alike now faced a reality she had long feared but could never force him to confront. Watching someone who defined himself entirely by strength lose that defining trait created a kind of helplessness that no amount of experience or resilience could prepare her for. Friends and longtime associates echoed similar sentiments. They spoke of shock not at the idea of aging, but at how quickly the transformation seemed to accelerate once it began. The psychological toll of this period cannot be overstated. For a man whose sense of self was inseparable from control, the gradual loss of agency represented more than physical decline. It was an existential rupture. He was no longer the final authority, no longer the architect overseeing every detail. Decisions were being made without him. Narratives were unfolding beyond his reach, and the world he shaped continued to move forward without waiting for his approval. That realization alone could break someone less accustomed to dominance. For him, it appeared to trigger withdrawal rather than confrontation. He did not fight the shift publicly. He did not attempt to reframe it as a new chapter or legacy moment. Instead, he receded further, allowing others to fill the space he left behind. This retreat altered how people remembered him even before his story had concluded. His legacy, once defined by excess, ambition, and relentless drive, began to take on a more tragic dimension. The same qualities that fueled his rise now seemed inseparable from his fall. The refusal to slow down, to delegate meaningfully, to accept limits, had delivered extraordinary success at an extraordinary cost. Observers began to question whether the outcome could have been different, whether a more balanced life might have preserved both his health and his presence. These questions had no answers, only a lingering sense of inevitability. On a broader cultural level, the situation forced a reckoning with how power and identity are intertwined. His story became a cautionary reflection on what happens when a person becomes indistinguishable from their role. When a role fades, there is little left to hold on to. The empire he built continues to thrive, producing new stars, new stories, new spectacles. Yet the absence of its creator casts a long shadow. Not because the machine cannot function without him, but because his departure exposes the human cost hidden beneath decades of success. The tragedy here is not that the show goes on. It is that it goes on without acknowledgement of the man who made it possible, because acknowledging him would require confronting the reality of his decline. As time passes, the emotional distance grows. What once felt shocking begins to feel permanent. Fans adapt. The industry adapts. Life moves forward, but the sense of loss lingers, not just for what has been lost, but for what can never be recovered. A man who lived his entire life in motion, now reduced to stillness. A voice that once commanded silence, now surrounded by it. This is the consequence that resonates most deeply. Not the end of a career, but the quiet dismantling of an identity witnessed from afar by a world that does not quite know how to say goodbye. There are stories that never make headlines, moments that unfold far from cameras and crowds, and it is within those quiet spaces that the weight of this chapter becomes most apparent. Away from boardrooms and arenas, the man who once thrived on noise and confrontation has been living inside a shrinking world defined by routine, recovery, and reflection. Those who have seen him privately describe an atmosphere that feels restrained, almost fragile, as if every movement now carries a calculation that never existed before. The rituals that once symbolized discipline and dominance have been stripped of their power. Training sessions shortened or abandoned. Long workdays replaced by careful pacing. For someone who built his identity on pushing beyond limits, this enforced restraint has been deeply unsettling. Friends say there are moments when his old intensity flashes briefly, when he speaks with familiar conviction about ideas or memories, only for the energy to fade as quickly as it appears. These fleeting sparks serve as reminders of who he was, and perhaps who he still believes himself to be, even as reality insists otherwise. The contrast between past and present plays out in small, almost imperceptible ways. A pause before standing, a hand reaching for support, a silence where once there would have been instruction or critique. People who spent years walking on eggshells around him now speak softly, choosing words with care, unsure of how much strength remains behind his eyes. There's a sense that he is listening more than speaking, absorbing rather than directing, and that alone represents a radical departure from the man they once knew. In these quieter moments, memories surface uninvited. Stories from decades ago, names of performers long gone, events that once felt monumental now recalled with a strange detachment. Some interpret this as nostalgia. Others see it as the mind searching for solid ground in a present that feels unfamiliar. What is clear is that the past has become a refuge, a place where control still exists, where outcomes are already known. The present, by contrast, offers uncertainty and dependence, conditions he spent a lifetime avoiding. There are accounts of nights marked by restlessness, of a man who once thrived on exhaustion, now struggling with inactivity. Sleep comes in fragments. Pain, both physical and emotional, lingers in ways he can no longer will away. For years, he dismissed illness as weakness, treated injury as an obstacle to be ignored. Now, forced to confront the limits of his own body, he faces an adversary he cannot intimidate or outwork. This realization has reportedly been one of the hardest adjustments, not because of fear, but because it undermines the core belief that shaped his entire life. Those closest to him describe a quiet grief that does not manifest in tears or confession, but in withdrawal. Fewer phone calls, shorter conversations, a reluctance to engage with the outside world. It is as if retreating inward offers some measure of control when everything else feels unstable. Family members have spoken cautiously about the emotional distance that has grown, about the challenge of reaching someone who has always equated vulnerability with failure. Yet there are also moments of tenderness that few ever witnessed before. Expressions of gratitude that once felt unnecessary. Acknowledgments of effort from those who care for him. Small gestures that suggest an awareness, perhaps even an acceptance of dependence. These moments do not erase the past, but they complicate it, revealing dimensions of a personality long overshadowed by force and ambition. For longtime colleagues, visiting him has become an emotionally charged experience. They arrive expecting the familiar intensity, the probing questions, the implicit tests of loyalty and competence. Instead, they encounter a quieter presence, one that listens more than it commands. Some leave shaken, unsure how to reconcile this version with a figure who once dominated every interaction. Others find a strange sense of closure in seeing the human cost behind a myth. They speak of conversations that drift toward philosophy, toward questions of legacy and memory, topics he once avoided in favor of immediate action. These discussions do not feel rehearsed or performative. They feel tentative, as if he is exploring territory he never allowed himself to enter before. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of these hidden stories is the sense of unfinished business that permeates them. He spent a lifetime orchestrating outcomes, ensuring that every chapter unfolded on his terms. Now, faced with an ending he cannot fully script, there is an underlying tension between acceptance and resistance. Some days appear calm, reflective, almost peaceful. Others are marked by frustration, by the impulse to reassert control that no longer responds. This internal struggle plays out quietly, witnessed only by a small circle of people, but it defines this phase more than any public rumor ever could. What emerges from these private glimpses is not a dramatic confession or a sudden transformation, but a gradual confrontation with self. A man who built an empire by denying weakness, now forced to live with it daily. A figure who thrived on spectacle, now confined to the margins of his own creation. These are not scenes designed for an audience. They are moments of reckoning, unfolding without applause or acknowledgement. And in that sense, they may be the most honest chapter of all. When the noise finally recedes and the spectacle falls away, what remains is the question that lingers beneath every powerful life built on momentum and force. What does it all mean once the motion stops? The legacy of a man like Vince McMahon cannot be measured solely by numbers, contracts, or global reach. It must be understood through contradiction, vision paired with obsession, innovation entwined with control, triumph achieved at the expense of balance. His achievements reshaped an industry and altered popular culture in ways that will endure long after his name fades from headlines. He turned a regional curiosity into a worldwide phenomenon, blurred the line between sport and theater, and taught audiences to embrace spectacle without apology. These accomplishments are undeniable, and they carry a weight that history will not easily dismiss. Yet the cost of that legacy is written just as clearly in the quiet moments that followed. A life spent pushing against the limits leaves little space for rest when those limits finally assert themselves. The same drive that allowed him to see possibilities where others saw boundaries also prevented him from stepping back when stepping back might have preserved more than it sacrificed. His story invites reflection not only on success, but on the definition of it. Is success the ability to dominate an industry, or is it the capacity to endure without losing oneself in the process? For decades, he answered that question through action, choosing expansion over pause, control over delegation, intensity over restraint. Those choices built an empire, but they also narrowed his world until there was little room left outside of work. In that narrowing, the seeds of this moment were planted. As time caught up with him, the contrast between what he created and what he lost became impossible to ignore. The irony is that his greatest strength became his greatest vulnerability. He believed so completely in effort, in willpower, in the idea that work could solve anything, that he left himself unprepared for a reality where effort was no longer enough. In that sense, his life mirrors the stories he once told through his creations. Heroes rise through sacrifice, only to face a reckoning when sacrifice demands more than they can give. Villains cling to power until it slips through their fingers. The difference here is that there is no script to guide the ending, no crowd to react on cue. There's only reflection, and reflection is something he avoided for most of his life. The legacy he leaves is therefore complex and unfinished. To some, he will always represent unchecked ambition, a symbol of excess and dominance that shaped both opportunities and harm. To others, he will be remembered as a visionary who saw potential where none existed and refused to accept limits imposed by tradition. Both interpretations can coexist because both are true. His impact cannot be separated from his flaws, and his flaws cannot erase his impact. Perhaps the most enduring lesson of his story lies not in judgment, but in recognition. Recognition that greatness achieved through relentless control carries consequences that do not disappear with age. Recognition that identity built entirely around power leaves little room for peace when power fades. And recognition that even the most formidable figures are ultimately bound by the same human constraints as everyone else. In confronting those constraints, there's an opportunity for meaning that does not depend on dominance or spectacle. Whether he ever fully embraces that opportunity is something only those closest to him will know. From a distance, all that can be seen is the outline of a life that burned intensely and now flickers more softly, illuminating both its brilliance and its cost. The empire continues. The stories continue. New generations will grow up knowing the world he helped create without ever seeing him at its center. That, too, is part of the legacy. Influence that outlives presence. Creation that survives its creator. In the end, his story asks a simple but unsettling question. When the applause fades and control slips away, what remains of a life defined by command? The answer is not found in records or revenue, but in the quiet understanding that legacy is not only what we build, but what we are forced to confront when building is no longer possible. As this story reaches its quiet edge, there is no dramatic cue to signal an ending, no music swelling beneath a final image, only the slow realization that something fundamental has already passed. For decades, the world Vince McMahon shaped followed one unbreakable rule. The show always went on. Injuries were absorbed, scandals were reframed, and even personal collapse was turned into spectacle. Momentum was sacred. Stillness was unacceptable. And yet here, at the far end of that philosophy, stillness is exactly what remains. The absence that once felt temporary now feels structural. The man who demanded constant motion has receded into a silence that no amount of production can fill. What makes this ending so unsettling is not that it arrived, but how it arrived. Without ceremony, without acknowledgement, without control. The empire he built continues to operate with precision, efficiency, and confidence, but its creator no longer stands at the center. and that absence has reshaped how everything is perceived. Fans no longer ask what he will do next. They ask whether there will ever be a next at all. This shift forces a reevaluation that goes beyond one individual. It asks what happens when a myth dissolves without warning, when the figure who embodied certainty becomes a question mark. For those who admired him, the sadness comes from watching an icon fade without a farewell. For those who criticized him, the discomfort comes from realizing that accountability and mortality do not always arrive in the ways we expect. There is no neat moral resolution here, no clear moment of reckoning that balances the scales. There is only the quiet truth that time does not negotiate. In many ways, this ending feels unfinished because it is unfinished. There has been no public reckoning, no definitive statement, no narrative closure to help people process the transition. The lack of clarity leaves space for reflection, and reflection invites complexity. It allows admiration and criticism to coexist without cancellation or absolution. It allows the story to be remembered not as a single arc, but as a layered human experience shaped by ambition, fear, control, and vulnerability. The final image that lingers is not one of triumph or defeat, but of contrast. A man who once commanded arenas now exists beyond the spotlight. A voice that once dictated outcomes now echoes only in memory. The world he created keeps moving forward, proving the strength of his vision, even as it underscores his absence. That contradiction may be the most honest summary of his life. Power built something extraordinary, and power also isolated the one who wielded it. As audiences look back, what remains is not just the legacy of an industry transformed, but a cautionary echo about identity. When purpose is narrowed to control, the loss of control can feel like the loss of self. When life is defined by momentum, stillness becomes frightening. And when a person becomes inseparable from their creation, stepping away can feel like erasure rather than rest. Yet within that erasure, there's a strange humanity. The myth cracks, and through those cracks, a man emerges. Older, worn, no longer performing, just existing. That image, uncomfortable as it may be, carries its own quiet truth. It reminds us that behind every towering figure is a human body that ages, a mind that tires, and a life that eventually demands reflection. The silence surrounding Vince McMahon is not empty. It is heavy with meaning. It speaks of an era closing without asking permission, of a legacy that will be debated long after its architect can no longer shape the conversation. Whether this is truly the final chapter or merely a prolonged pause is something no one can say with certainty. He has surprised the world before, and part of his myth was built on the belief that he would never stay gone. But even myths have limits, and sometimes the most definitive ending is not a dramatic exit, but a quiet fading that leaves everyone searching for words. In the end, what we are left with is a question rather than a conclusion. How will this story be remembered? As the rise and fall of a titan? As the cost of unrelenting ambition? Or as a human life that burned brightly and then dimmed without spectacle? The answer will depend on who is remembering and why. And perhaps that is fitting. A man who spent his life controlling narratives leaves behind a story that no longer belongs to him, but to those who watched, worked, and grew up within the world he created. That story now lives on in memory, in debate, and in the quiet space where certainty once stood.